Oceans are our lifeblood. Covering 71% of the planet, they produce more than half the oxygen in the atmosphere. But now, the oceans are becoming a danger to us. Sea levels worldwide have been rising as a result of climate change. A lot is at stake, especially for the Pacific nation of Tuvalu. If the ocean continues to rise, it's at risk of being completely submerged. Will Tuvalu be the first country to be wiped off the map by climate change? Our oceans are vast, spanning 2/3 of the planet and accounting for 97% of our water. But now, our seas have become monsters because of climate change.
As a storm chaser and adventurer, I've spent years traveling all over the world documenting the most extreme forces of nature. But now, I'm going after the bigger picture of climate change.
In the last 5 years, I've witnessed increasingly violent storms, flooding, and hurricanes that have devastated communities in Thailand, the Philippines, and the USA. More and more, I'm seeing that much of our extreme weather is directly connected to climate change. Scientists agree that oceans are getting hotter and higher, making them unpredictable and dangerous.
The last 12 months have brought some really bad news in terms of sea level rise. It's just rising fast. Now it's 3.2 millimetres a year. Places like Tuvalu and the Pacific Islands, the low-lying atoll countries, are in real trouble. I mean, they will go under the sea. At some point this century, they'll go underwater.
I'm on my way to the tiny island nation of Tuvalu to investigate this firsthand. Located in the Pacific Ocean, midway between Australia and Hawaii, Tuvalu is a cluster of 9 islands. My arrival here in Tuvalu is ominous. There's torrential rain and the whole area is flooded.
This is the wet season, and we're in an area that's a South Pacific convergent zone where you've got different wind currents coming together, which then go up, creating rain and thunderstorms and tremendous amounts of flooding, it seems.
With only 10 square miles of dry land, Tuvalu is one of the smallest countries in the world. An average elevation of 6 feet makes Tuvalu extremely vulnerable to storms and sea level rise. The rains are incredible. All over the island, people are struggling to keep their homes dry.
Usually when this place floods out, it's from the sea, which is about 30 yards that way. Today, torrential thunderstorms, freshwater flooding. This island can't catch a break.
I meet with local meteorologist Tuvalu.
So it's been a busy 24 hours for you. You've never seen this much rain in 24 hours.
And we measure around 347 millimeter in one day.
That sounds like something you'd get on a mountainside in a cyclone.
That's history. And it's not linked to any tropical cyclone or what. I mean, it's just a rain band, a convection zone, really active right on top of Tuvalu.
Just perfectly aligned right on top of the island for hours and hours and hours.
Tuvalu experiences seasonally high tides that the locals call king tides. But in the last few years, these tides have been changing.
We call it king tides. That's the normal high tide. The normal high tide, but it's higher than normal.
If the king tide was yesterday, combined with the storm and the flooding and maybe a little bit of surge from the storm, that would be catastrophic.
Yes, of course. Because of our elevation really low, so low-lying places and coastal areas get inundated and eroded.
It's not just you that's being affected, it's everyone else. It just so happens that your island is very low.
Yes.
So it's going to be seen here first.
We are the front line.
Tuvalu has few natural defenses against these high tides.
One thing the locals have done is to try and help prevent the king tides by putting these barrels filled with concrete. Of course, not really working so well here. A few of them been knocked down during a storm. The concept seems sound, but the implementation, I don't know.
The island can barely cope with tropical downpours, let alone more storms. This one has finally passed, but the damage on the island is long-lasting.
Yesterday there was some torrential rain like I haven't seen in a long, long time anywhere. And some of the houses here are actually flooded out by that. It's not just seawater they have to worry about here, it's rainwater as well. So this place got totally flooded out yesterday?
Yeah, starting at 8 o'clock last night, the water started coming in and the family was totally sleeping. They didn't know what was happening till the neighbors called out. So around about 8, the water was all over here, going inside. It was flooded everywhere.
Let's take a look. Wow. Everything is up on tables.
This is the first time that they have experienced this and have been evacuated. They just put up everything that are useful for the family, like the refrigerators and everything, and put up high.
Where did they end up going?
They went up to the Tuvalu Red Cross.
Like many of the houses in Tuvalu, this house is located only 160 feet from the shore.
So could you imagine, with 5,000 or so people on this island, a major catastrophe?
If we have a 2 meters high king tide, it will just destroy us all.
The global sea level has been rising at a rate of 0.14 inches per year since the early 1990s, roughly twice the average speed of the preceding 80 years. It's a dangerous scenario. In the last century, the planet's temperature has risen at an alarming rate. Scientists have shown that human activities are driving temperatures up with our reliance on fossil fuels that emit greenhouse gases. As those gases trap more energy from the sun, oceans absorb more heat and expand. Climate scientists predict global temperatures will increase by 2 to 11 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. Higher temperatures are also leading to increased melting of glaciers and polar ice caps, resulting in greater runoffs into the ocean and increasing sea levels. I asked climate scientist Elizabeth Holland more about the data.
We looked at solar radiation, we looked at rising sea level, we looked at the temperature of the oceans, we looked at the temperature of the atmosphere, we looked at the temperature of the land. Warming is unequivocal. We've been able to say more and more strongly that humans are causing the warming.
As ocean surface temperatures heat up, scientists predict an increase in the number of intense storms. The islands of Tuvalu are so low-lying and small, only 400 yards at the widest point, that they could easily be submerged.
This is basically it. I'm surrounded by ocean on 3 sides of me, with just a tiny spit of land connecting me to the island. Probably the most vulnerable point on one of the most vulnerable islands. We've got the lagoon side over here and the ocean side here. It's all converging on this one tiny spit. One thing that scientists are certainly in agreement about is that a lot of the heat that's trapped by greenhouse gases is getting absorbed by the oceans.
Let's see how warm the ocean is today.
Okay, so just over 80 degrees. As the water heats up, it will expand, and that actually contributes to global sea level rise. But that 80-degree point, that's sort of the threshold for tropical cyclone formation. You need water of at least that warm, and we've certainly got it here. Such a low-lying island is really at risk for not only sea level rise, but the torrential storm surge flooding that you can get during tropical cyclone season. I tell you, I wouldn't want to be standing right here during one.
Increased sea temperatures can have devastating consequences across the globe. Rising oceans are one of the deadliest results of climate change.
Warm water is the fuel for hurricanes, typhoons, tropical cyclones. And the warmer the seawater, the more we're going to see of these storms, and particularly the strength of these storms. A low-lying island like Tuvalu is particularly at risk. Today, we've got just a regular stormy day, and already this wind-driven surge is causing tremendous waves to crash much higher than the regular high tide. So to be on this island during a cyclone, it would totally swamp the island, and they do get cyclones here.
Across the globe, we're already witnessing increasingly violent storms.
But what we can now say with absolute clarity is that climate change is a very strong influence on these extreme weather events, and in some cases, the strongest influence.
It's not just low-lying islands that are vulnerable to hurricanes. New York City, which is only 33 feet above sea level, was brought to a standstill by Hurricane Sandy. I was in New York for Sandy, and even though I've been an active storm chaser for over 15 years, it was one of the most intense storms I've ever experienced.
The storm surge during Sandy was 13 feet above normal. It was one of the most devastating and expensive natural disasters in U.S. history.
117 people were killed, and it cost the U.S. $65 billion.
It created an unprecedented surge for that part of the world.
51 square miles of the city were flooded. That's 17% of the city landmass. More than 440,000 New Yorkers were living in the areas that Sandy flooded. I watched the storm come in from Rockaway Beach.
I was able to go up onto the boardwalk, which was maybe 10 feet above the beach, and I knew that the place was going to be completely demolished. I could see the violent waves just churning away, and I knew that the winds were going to shift as the storm got further inland, and that's exactly what happened. We knew we had to get out of there, or else we wouldn't get out of there.
I drove to higher ground, but all around me, whole neighborhoods in Queens and Brooklyn were underwater.
Such a storm used to only happen about once every 100 years, but now we're seeing these devastating storms more and more often.
Only 1 year later, on the other side of the world in the Philippines, Typhoon Haiyan hit, killing over 6,000 people.
Typhoon Haiyan was probably the strongest storm to ever make landfall. It was a Category 5 typhoon that hit the city of Tacloban directly. The storm surge with that was completely devastating. It came in like a tsunami. The Philippines gets hit quite frequently. They're used to typhoons. They've never seen anything like this one. It was so devastating that it was almost beyond comprehension, the level of damage and destruction that was caused by this storm. And I think that as sea levels get warmer and higher, it's inevitable we're putting ourselves at greater risk to the wrath of these marine storms, whether it's a hurricane, a typhoon, a tropical cyclone. They're all feeding off of this warm ocean water. And the sea surface temperatures have just been going up and up and up. It's not a matter of if, but when a major coastal city like Miami or Tampa gets hit by a major hurricane.
The danger on Tuvalu isn't just from these massive storms. There's also a serious threat from below. I've come to Tuvalu in the South Pacific to witness firsthand the effects of climate change.
For a little bit of perspective, about 80% of the island is no more than 4 feet above sea level. The highest point being about 15 feet, and about 40% of the population lives within 100 yards of the ocean. If there's any place in the world that is at the mercy of the sea, it's this place right here.
The rising seas are also forcing farmers to abandon their crops. Salt water from higher tides is soaking through the ground, contaminating the underground source of fresh water and destroying crops. Indigenous food, such as pulaka and coconut, are being destroyed. Reverend Tafui Lusama is deeply concerned with the impact of rising sea levels.
If salt water enters into it, it kills all our traditional plants. Land and the sea are the sources which sustain our livelihood daily. You lose your land, you lose your life.
Tonight, I'm joining the Tira Taula family for a traditional home-cooked meal. But foods like this are becoming harder to harvest.
This is a steamed fish. Definitely very hot. Red fruit and banana with talolo, cooked with talolo.
Local foods may soon be a thing of the past.
What a treat to enjoy some South Pacific hospitality. Going into someone's home, having a home-cooked meal. It's the best.
Our people can no longer depend on our traditional way of life, so we are left with no option but to turn into a market-based lifestyle.
With traditional crops being threatened by rising oceans, locals are relying on more processed foods.
With all of these changes that have been going on, it's become more and more difficult for the farmers here to grow some of the traditional food crops. And especially since World War II, they've become quite dependent on foreign-made processed food. And doesn't really help them in their struggle for food security, which is becoming a big issue here in Tuvalu.
The country now imports 80% of its food, which is costly to the islanders.
We're Pacific Islanders. We have a lot of ties to our land, our ocean. Our identity is very much built around how we relate to our land, how we relate to our ocean, and all of that is threatened, right?
People have lived in Tuvalu for 2,000 years, but some islanders are now leaving, scared that climate change and rising sea levels will make life on the island nearly impossible.
Our identity as a people will disappear, will die out. If I am relocated because of climate change and my country has gone down, where do I belong? I have no roots.
Tuvalu is not responsible for the catastrophe it's facing. It's no surprise the largest emitters of man-made greenhouse gases are the world's largest countries: China, United States, the EU, and India.
Here in the islands, we contribute the least to greenhouse gas emissions, yet we're the most affected.
Tuvalu, the fourth smallest country in the world, has almost no carbon emissions, but they're at the front line.
As those in the developed world drive their cars and turn up their heat or decide to build one more coal-fired power plant, it is the Tuvalus of the world that will go underwater because of those choices.
Environmental activists are taking up the cause, encouraging the people of the Pacific Islands to fight for changes on a local and global scale. In 2014, they took their fight to Australia and blocked the largest coal port with canoes to make their voices heard.
Right now, that's the message that we want to get out there. Climate change is real, we are living with it, and sooner or later the world needs to change if we don't start demanding that the world transitions to more renewable sources of energy.
There's no plan B.
There's no plan B, there's no planet B.
But Tuvalu is fighting back. In an effort to hold on to their island, the locals have raised money from an unlikely source.
Each country has its own internet suffix. .de for Germany, .au for Australia, .ca for Canada. Well, here in Tuvalu, they've got .tv. And .tv has become so popular, especially amongst people in the television world, that it has quite an appeal.
The money raised by selling the suffix goes into repairing roads, improving barriers, and planting mangrove trees to fight against coastal erosion.
If worse comes to worst and Tuvalu disappears under the waves, that suffix will still exist, creating what could possibly be the world's first virtual country existing only in cyberspace.
While Tuvalu is disappearing, it's far from alone in its coastal erosion.
The problem is not confined to Tuvalu. It's not peculiar to Tuvalu only. It's a global problem.
The Maldives are also under threat. A unique archipelago made up of 2,000 islands could almost disappear into the sea by the end of the century if nothing is done to curb global warming. It's not just low-lying island communities that are at risk. With predictions that sea levels could rise by up to 6 feet over the next century, South Florida will be badly affected. A 3-foot rise would take away 1/3 of the land, and a 6-foot rise would submerge half the area. The condos that line Miami's waterfront would disappear.
What do you think is the biggest misconception about climate change in general?
The biggest misconception is that because it's a slow process, we can wait to take action. Because climate change is a very slow process, but we're at that tipping point. We need to take action today.
The people of Tuvalu are desperate for the rest of the world to sit up and pay attention.
What does the world need to know about Tuvalu?
I think it's very important that that we are part of the world. And I think that as a Tuvaluan, despite how small we are, we need to speak out that we do exist and we are parts of who you are, whether you are in Canada or in America. We are all we are the people of this world, and we need to be together and work together.
Just a month after I left Tuvalu, Cyclone Pam tore through the neighboring Pacific islands of Vanuatu, causing extensive damage. It also affected Tuvalu, forcing it to declare a state of emergency. This cyclone is a painful reminder that action must be taken. Global temperatures cannot be allowed to rise another 2 degrees. If countries around the world can find a way to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, then Tuvalu and other countries in danger will have a fighting chance at survival.